The scream that pierced through the howling Yukon wind wasn't human, at least not entirely. I'd heard that sound before, during my nursing days in the territorial hospital, when children's voices broke under pain too great for their small bodies to contain. But this cry came from the frozen river, where no child should have been at sunset on a February evening in 1918. My trap line could wait. Something in that desperate wail made every instinct I'd developed over 3 years of solitary living. Scream that lives hung in the balance. The temperature had dropped to 30 below, and the river ice groaned like a dying giant beneath the weight of another brutal Yukon winter. As I grabbed my snowshoes and rifle, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold settled deep in my bones. What I was about to discover would change everything I thought I knew about this unforgiving land, and about the secrets it kept buried beneath its frozen surface. I fought my way through knee-deep snow toward the riverbank, each step a battle, against the wind that tried to push me back toward my cabin's warmth. The cry came again, weaker now, more desperate, and I could make out 2 distinct voices calling out in what sounded like broken English mixed with something else, something foreign. My breath formed ice crystals that clung to the fur trim of my parka as I crested the small hill that separated my trapping grounds from the main channel of the Yukon. Through the swirling snow, I could barely make out 2 dark shapes clinging to what looked like an overturned sled near the river's edge. The sight made my blood run cold for reasons beyond the Arctic temperature. In all my years living alone on this stretch of the river, I'd never seen anyone attempt to cross at this particular bend. The locals in Eagle Village, 20 miles downstream, had warned me that the ice here was treacherous, honeycombed with air pockets that could give way without warning. But there they were, 2 small figures fighting for their lives against the relentless grip of the northern wilderness. As I drew closer, sliding down the embankment with my rifle slung across my back, I could see they were children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 and a boy perhaps 2 years younger. Their sled had broken through a section of thin ice, and they were trapped on a small shelf of solid ground between the open water and the main riverbank. The girl was trying desperately to pull her companion away from the dark water that lapped hungrily at the ice edge, but both children were soaked through and shivering violently in the killing cold. Their lips were already blue, and I knew from my medical training that hypothermia was setting in fast. Without immediate intervention, they would be dead within the hour. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd come to this remote wilderness to escape the endless parade of death I'd witnessed during the influenza outbreak, only to find myself once again racing against time to save lives. But as I secured my rope around a sturdy spruce and prepared to rappel down to them, something nagged at the back of my mind about how they'd ended up in this impossible situation. "Hold on!" I called out in English, then repeated the phrase in the broken French I'd learned from the old-timers at the trading post. The girl looked up at me with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone her age, eyes that reminded me of the shell-shocked soldiers I'd treated before taking my position in the territories. She said something to the boy in what sounded like Russian or maybe Ukrainian, and he nodded weakly before they both reached up toward my descending rope. The wind was picking up, and I could feel the temperature dropping even further as the sun disappeared behind the mountains across the river. My hands, even through thick mittens, were beginning to lose feeling as I worked to secure a harness, around the smaller boy first. He was barely conscious, his small body racked with shivers that were already beginning to slow, a dangerous sign that his body was shutting down. As I lifted him, his coat fell open slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something stitched into the inner lining, a symbol I couldn't quite make out in the failing light. But something about that brief flash of embroidery sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind. Getting both children back to my cabin became a race against death itself, with each minute of exposure bringing them closer, to the point of no return. The girl, who introduced herself weakly as Katya, was able to walk with assistance, but the boy, her brother Dmitri, she told me, had to be carried. My cabin was only half a mile from the river, but in waist-deep snow and carrying a child, it might as well have been on the other side of the territory. Katya stumbled alongside me, her breath coming in short, painful gasps that created small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. She kept mumbling something in her native tongue, words that sounded like prayers or maybe warnings. I couldn't tell which. By the time I could see the welcome glow of my cabin's windows through the trees, my own strength was nearly spent, and I was beginning to worry that my 3 years of trapping had left me too isolated, too out of practice with the basic human interaction required for a crisis like this. But as we reached my door and I felt the blessed warmth of the wood stove hit my face, I realized that getting them to safety was only the beginning. The real mystery of who these children were and how they'd ended up on that deadly stretch of river was about to unfold in ways I could never have imagined. Inside my cabin, I went into full medical mode, stripping both children of their wet clothes and wrapping them in every blanket and fur I owned before setting them close to the roaring fire. Their core body temperatures were dangerously low, and I had to warm them gradually to avoid shock, a process I'd learned during my nursing days when frostbite victims would arrive at the hospital more dead than alive. Katya remained conscious, but disoriented, while Dmitri slipped in and out of awareness, his small body fighting the kind of battle that would have killed grown men. As I prepared hot broth and checked their extremities for signs of frostbite, I noticed that both children had calluses on their hands that spoke of hard labor, and their clothes, though well-made, showed the wear patterns of people who had traveled, far and rough. There were other details, too. The way Katya's eyes constantly moved toward the windows, as if expecting someone or something to appear out of the darkness, and how both children flinched whenever I moved too quickly. These weren't just lost travelers. They were children who had learned to be afraid, children who had been running from something. And as I helped them sip the warm broth, I began to wonder what kind of danger could drive 2 young ones out onto the deadliest stretch of the Yukon River in the middle of an Arctic winter. It was while I was hanging their wet clothes near the fire to dry that I got my first clear look at the symbol I'd glimpsed on the boy's coat. Stitched into the inner lining of both garments, in thread that had once been gold but was now faded and worn, was an emblem unlike anything I'd seen in my travels through the Northern Territories. It depicted what looked like a sailing ship, surrounded by a circle of stars with strange symbols, possibly Cyrillic letters, worked into the design around the border. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of detailed work that spoke of old-world skill and pride, but the thread had been deliberately darkened in places, as if someone had tried to make the emblem less noticeable. My hands trembled slightly as I traced the outline of the ship with my finger, because I had seen this symbol before. Not in person, but in the newspaper clipping I'd kept in my Bible, a story about the steamboat Northern Star that had been found wrecked and abandoned, upriver near Dawson City 3 years earlier. The authorities had never found the passengers or crew, and the official report had blamed the wreck on ice damage and poor navigation. But the clipping had included a photograph of personal effects found scattered along the riverbank, and I was almost certain that one of those items had borne this same distinctive emblem. The coincidence seemed impossible, but as I looked at the 2 children sleeping fitfully by my fire, I began to wonder if what I'd stumbled upon wasn't coincidence at all. As the night wore on and I kept vigil over my unexpected guests, checking their breathing and adjusting their blankets, my mind kept returning to that newspaper story and the questions it had left unanswered. The Northern Star had been carrying passengers from Seattle to Dawson City during the spring of 1915, mostly families seeking their fortunes in the gold fields or fleeing some kind of trouble in the lower states. When the wreck was discovered, the cargo hold was found to be empty except for personal belongings, leading authorities to speculate that the passengers had managed to escape before the boat went down. But no survivors had ever been found, no bodies had been recovered, and no one had come forward to claim the scattered possessions found along the riverbank. The whole incident had been quietly forgotten. Just another tragedy in a land where tragedy was as common as snow. Now, as I watched these two children sleep, their faces peaceful for the first time since I'd pulled them from the river, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to that long-ago disaster in ways that would prove to be far more dangerous than the frozen river they'd escaped. Because in my 3 years of solitary living, I'd learned that the Yukon never gives up its secrets easily, and sometimes when it does, those secrets come with a price that few are prepared to pay. The sound that woke me near dawn wasn't the usual crack and groan of the cabin settling in the cold, but something else entirely. The distant sound of dogs barking, not the wild, lonely howl of wolves, but the purposeful barking of a sled team moving fast through the wilderness. I'd been dozing fitfully in my chair beside the fire, my rifle across my knees and one ear always listening for changes in the children's breathing, when the sound cut through the pre-dawn stillness like a blade. Katya's eyes snapped open at the same moment mine did, and the look of pure terror that crossed her face told me everything I needed to know about who might be coming down the river trail. She sat up quickly, ignoring the blankets that fell away from her small shoulders, and grabbed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone who had nearly frozen to death less than 8 hours earlier. "They found us," she whispered in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear, and in those 3 words, I heard the confirmation of what I'd already begun to suspect. The emblem in their coats, their presence on that dangerous stretch of river, their obvious terror. None of it was coincidence, and whatever these children were running from had just caught up with all 3 of us. The barking grew closer, and I could now distinguish at least 6 dogs in the team. A serious expedition, not some casual trapper making his rounds. Katya was already pulling on her still damp clothes with fingers that shook from more than just the cold, while Dmitri stirred restlessly on his makeshift bed of furs. I moved to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass, trying to make out shapes in the pre-dawn gloom, but the snow was still falling steadily, creating a curtain that hid whatever was approaching down the river trail. The sound of runners cutting through packed snow reached my ears, accompanied by a man's voice calling commands in what sounded like the same language the children had been speaking. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that whoever was coming knew exactly where they were headed. This wasn't a chance encounter or a rescue party from Eagle Village. These were hunters, and my cabin had become the trap. As I checked the load in my rifle, I caught Katya watching me with those ancient eyes, and I knew that the next few minutes would determine whether we all lived to see the sunrise. "Hide," I whispered to the children, pointing toward the small storage room behind my kitchen where I kept my winter supplies. But Katya shook her head violently, her small face set with a determination that reminded me of the battlefield nurses who had refused to abandon their posts even as shells fell around the hospital tents. She pulled something from the inner pocket of her coat, a small leather-wrapped bundle that she pressed into my hands with urgent desperation. The leather was soft and worn, stained dark with what looked like old blood, and inside I could feel the outline of something hard and rectangular. "The truth," she whispered in her broken English, then added something in her native tongue that sounded like a prayer or maybe a curse. Before I could ask what she meant, the sound of the dog team stopped abruptly just outside my door, followed by the unmistakable sound of men dismounting from a sled and checking their weapons. Through the thin cabin walls, I could hear low voices, speaking in that foreign language, and though I couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakably that of predators who had cornered their prey. Whatever was wrapped in that leather bundle suddenly felt heavier than gold in my hands, and I had the sinking feeling that I was holding the reason why 2 children had risked death on the frozen Yukon rather than face whatever was waiting for them outside my door. The knock, when it came, was polite, almost civilized, which somehow made it more terrifying than if they had simply broken down the door. "Good morning," called a voice in heavily accented English, the words carefully pronounced as if the speaker had practiced them. "We are looking for 2 children who may have become lost in the storm last night. We have reason to believe they may have sought shelter here." I glanced at Katya, who had gone absolutely still, her face pale as the snow outside, while young Dmitri whimpered softly in his sleep, still too weak to fully understand the danger. The voice outside continued, patient but insistent. "We are... Their family, you understand. Their uncle sent us to bring them home safely." But the lie was so obvious, it might as well have been written in the snow. No uncle would send armed men with a full dog team to collect lost children, and certainly not men who spoke with the careful diction of those trying to hide their true intentions. I could feel the weight of the leather bundle in my coat pocket, and suddenly I understood that whatever secret these children carried was worth killing for. As I moved toward the door, my rifle held ready but not obviously threatening, I realized that my simple life as a trapper was about to become infinitely more complicated than I had ever imagined. Through the small window beside my door, I could see 3 men standing in the snow, their faces partially hidden by fur-trimmed hoods, but their posture spoke of military training and violent purpose. The leader was tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my cabin's defenses, while his companions flanked him in a formation that blocked any escape route toward the river. All 3 carried rifles, and I noticed that their clothing, while adapted for the northern climate, had the look of quality merchandise, not the rough practical gear of wilderness travelers, but the kind of expedition outfitting that money could buy. Their sled was heavily loaded with supplies that suggested they had been prepared for an extended hunt, and their dogs were the lean, powerful animals favored by those who traveled fast and far in pursuit of their quarry. But it was the emblem I glimpsed on the leader's coat collar that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The same golden ship surrounded by stars that I had seen stitched into the children's clothing, except this version was bright and new, worn proudly rather than hidden. These men weren't just hunting the children. They were part of whatever organization or conspiracy the children had fled from, and judging by their equipment and determination, they had been tracking their quarry for a very long time. "I haven't seen any children," I called through the door, keeping my voice steady despite the fear that was making my hands shake. "Been snowed in for 2 days myself. Wouldn't have seen anyone passing by." The lie came easily, but I knew it. Wouldn't hold up under scrutiny for long. The children's tracks from the river to my cabin would be visible despite the falling snow, and these men had the look of experienced trackers. The leader's response confirmed my fears. "Perhaps you would not mind if we looked around your property, just to be certain? We are very concerned for their safety in this terrible cold." The request was phrased politely, but the underlying threat was clear. They were going to search my cabin whether I agreed or not. I could hear the other 2 men moving around outside, probably checking for tracks or signs of recent activity, and I knew it was only a matter of minutes before they found evidence that the children had been here. Katya appeared at my elbow, having moved with the silent grace of someone who had learned to hide from dangerous men, and she pressed something else into my hand. A small key made of what looked like silver, worn smooth by generations of handling. "The steamboat," she whispered so quietly, I almost didn't hear her, and suddenly the pieces of this deadly puzzle began to click into place in my mind. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. The newspaper article about the Northern Star had mentioned that the ship's safe had been found open and empty, with no sign of the key that would have been needed to access it. At the time, investigators had assumed that whatever valuables the safe contained had been swept away by the river when the boat broke up, but now I wondered if the truth was far more sinister. The key in my hand was small but heavy, with intricate, engravings that matched the style of the emblem on the men's clothing, and I began to understand that the children weren't just random refugees. They were the inheritors of some secret that these armed men would kill to possess. As the sound of boots approached my door more closely, I made a decision that would change everything. I slipped both the leather bundle and the key into my deepest coat pocket, where they settled against my ribs like small, cold promises of danger. Whatever these children had been protecting, whatever secret had died with the passengers of the Northern Star, was now my responsibility as well. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a familiar surge of the same determination that had kept me working through the worst days of the influenza outbreak. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the cost was everything you had built for yourself in the wilderness. Outside, I could hear the men conferring in low voices, their words sharp with frustration and growing impatience. One of them had obviously found the trail from the river, and I caught fragments of what sounded like tactical planning. Who would cover which approach, how to handle resistance, what to do about witnesses. The casual way they discussed eliminating anyone who stood in their way told me everything I needed to know about the kind of men I was dealing with, and I realized that my remote cabin had become a battleground in a conflict that had been brewing since long before I arrived in the territory. Dmitri had awakened and was now huddled beside his sister, both children watching me with eyes that held too much knowledge of violence and betrayal for their young years. "They killed our parents," Katya whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that rattled my windows. "On the boat. They made it look like accident, but we saw." The confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect hit me like a physical blow. These children were the sole survivors of a massacre that had been covered up as a maritime disaster, and they had been living in hiding for 3 years, carrying secrets that powerful men would commit murder to keep buried. As the footsteps outside grew more purposeful, and I heard the distinctive sound of rifle bolts being worked, I knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The explosion of sound when they kicked in my door was like a gunshot in the confined space of the cabin, and suddenly my home was filled with armed strangers who moved with the coordinated precision of soldiers. The leader stepped through first, his pale eyes scanning the room and taking in every detail. The children huddled by the fire, my rifle in my hands, the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Dr. Morgan," he said, and the fact that he knew my name sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold air now pouring through my ruined door. "We meet at last. I trust you understand that this is not a social call." His English was perfect now, the careful pronunciation replaced by the fluid confidence of someone who had been pretending to be less fluent than he actually was, and I realized that everything about this encounter had been planned and orchestrated, from the moment they had tracked the children to my doorstep. As his companions spread out to block any chance of escape, their weapons trained on all 3 of us with professional competence, I understood that I had stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple rescue of 2 lost children. The emblem on their coats gleamed in the firelight like golden promises of death, and I knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just our survival, but whether the truth about the Northern Star would ever see the light of day. Standing there in my violated cabin, with armed killers pointing rifles at 2 children who had already lost everything, I felt something shift inside me, a transformation from the isolated trapper I had become back to the combat. Nurse who had fought death in field hospitals where the wounded arrived faster than we could save them. The leader was studying me with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential resistance, probably wondering whether I would be foolish enough to fight against impossible odds or smart enough to simply hand over what he had come for. But as I looked at Katya and Dmitri, saw the trust and desperate hope in their young faces, I realized that some choices transcend simple survival. Sometimes you have to decide what kind of person you want to die as, even if dying seems like the only option left. The leather bundle in my coat felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the small key like a burning coal against my ribs, and I understood that I was holding the evidence of crimes that reached far beyond this frozen cabin in the wilderness. Whatever these men represented, whether they were agents of a government, members of a criminal organization, or something else entirely, they had already proven they were willing to kill entire families to protect their secrets. As I tightened my grip on my rifle and prepared to make what might be the last decision of my life, I couldn't help but think that 3 years of solitary trapping had been poor preparation for becoming the final guardian of truths that powerful men would commit any atrocity to keep buried in the snow. The shot that saved our lives came from outside my cabin, a rifle crack that split the morning air and sent the leader spinning sideways into my kitchen table. Blood bloomed across his shoulder as he crashed into my dishes, and suddenly the careful coordination of his team dissolved into chaos as his men wheeled toward this new threat from the wilderness. Through my broken doorway, I could see a figure in traditional native clothing moving between the trees, with the fluid grace of someone who knew every inch of this frozen landscape. And I realized that we weren't as alone as I had thought in this deadly game of cat and mouse. The children didn't hesitate. Katya grabbed her brother's hand and pulled him toward the back window of my cabin, moving with the desperate efficiency of those who had learned that survival meant being ready to run at any moment. As bullets began flying in both directions and my home transformed into a battlefield, I clutched the leather bundle and silver key that had already cost so many lives, and wondered who our mysterious savior was and whether they understood the true magnitude of what they had just stepped into. The emblem on the wounded leader's coat caught the firelight as he struggled to regain his footing, and I knew that this was only the beginning of a conflict that stretched far beyond the walls of my violated sanctuary. The gunfight lasted only minutes, but in the confined space of my cabin it felt like hours of deafening chaos that left my ears ringing and my lungs burning with gunpowder smoke. Our rescuer moved like a ghost through the trees outside, never staying in one position long enough for the invaders to get a clear shot, picking off the armed men with the methodical precision of someone who had fought this kind of warfare before. When the last of the 3 killers fell face first into the snow outside my door, the sudden silence was almost more shocking than the violence that had preceded it. The figure that emerged from the tree line was an elderly native man I recognized as Thomas Crow Feather, a trapper and guide who occasionally traded at the same posts I did, though we had never spoken more than a few words to each other. His weathered face was grim as he stepped over the bodies of the men who had tried to murder us. And when he looked at me through my shattered doorway, I saw knowledge in his dark eyes that went far deeper than simple wilderness wisdom. "You need to get those children away from here," he said in English that was far more educated than his rough appearance suggested, and I realized that there were layers to this man that I had never suspected during our brief encounters at the Mai trading posts. Thomas moved through my cabin with the careful steps of someone assessing damage after a battle, his eyes taking in the children huddled by the back window and the secrets I was still clutching in my coat pocket. "How long have
you known?"
I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was asking about. Whether he had known about the children, about the men hunting them, or about the larger conspiracy that seemed to have tentacles reaching into every corner of the Northern Territories. His answer came with a bitter laugh that held no humor. "Long enough to know that those emblems you're looking at have been bringing death to this land since before you ever came north, Dr. Morgan." The casual way he used my name and title told me that he had been watching me far more closely than I had ever realized, and I began to understand that my 3 years of supposed isolation had been an illusion. There were eyes in this wilderness that saw everything, and networks of information that stretched between trappers' cabins and native villages like an invisible web. As he knelt beside the children and spoke to them in what sounded like their own language, I saw relief flood their faces for the first time since I had pulled them from the river, and I realized that Thomas Crow Feather was far more than just Another northern trapper caught up in our desperate situation. "The village knows," Thomas said as he helped me gather supplies for what was obviously going to be a hasty evacuation of my cabin. "Word came down the river 2 days ago that men with the golden ship were hunting something, asking questions in places where questions aren't usually welcome." His words confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that the conspiracy surrounding the children and the Northern Star reached far beyond these 3 dead men, and that our survival depended on staying ahead of a network that had resources and reach I was only beginning to comprehend. Katya was helping her brother gather their few belongings, but I noticed that she kept glancing toward the bodies outside with an expression that mixed fear with something darker, a hunger for justice that reminded me uncomfortably of the soldiers I had treated who had seen too much of war's brutality. Thomas caught my expression and nodded grimly. "She's been carrying that anger for 3 years, waiting for a chance to make them pay for what they did to her family. But revenge is a luxury none of us can afford right now, not with what's coming." His cryptic warning sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold air pouring through my ruined door, and I realized that whatever we had faced this morning was just the advance guard of something much larger and more dangerous. The journey to Eagle Village took us through wilderness that Thomas navigated with the supernatural confidence of someone who had been born to this land, following trails that were invisible to my eyes but clear as highways to his experienced gaze. We traveled on snowshoes, pulling a makeshift sled loaded with essential supplies, while Thomas ranged ahead and behind us like a scout, ensuring we weren't being followed by additional hunters. The children moved with the endurance of those who had been running for their lives for years, but I could see the toll that constant fear had taken on their young bodies. They were too thin, too watchful, too ready to disappear into the landscape at the first sign of danger. As we crested a ridge that offered a view back toward my cabin, I could see smoke rising from the direction of my former home, and Thomas confirmed my fears. "They'll burn it," he said matter-of-factly. "Standard procedure when an operation goes wrong. Destroy all evidence and eliminate any traces that might lead back to their organization." The casual way he discussed the destruction of my life's work told me that he had seen this pattern before, and I began to wonder how many other isolated trappers and homesteaders had found themselves caught up in this deadly game without ever understanding the rules. The leather bundle and silver key seemed to grow heavier with each step, and I found myself wondering if the secrets they contained were worth the price we were all paying to protect them. Eagle Village appeared through the swirling snow like something from a frontier legend, a collection of log cabins and native dwellings clustered around a trading post that served as the unofficial capital of this remote section of the territory. But as we approached the settlement, I could see that the usual bustle of winter activity was subdued, replaced by the watchful tension of a community that knew danger was approaching. Men stood in doorways with rifles close at hand, while women gathered children inside with the practiced efficiency of those who had faced threats before. Thomas led us directly to the largest cabin, where an elderly white man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command waited on the covered porch. "Dr. Morgan," he said with a slight nod of acknowledgement, "I'm Samuel Hutchins, postmaster and unofficial mayor of this frozen piece of nowhere. Thomas tells me you've stumbled into our local troubles." His casual reference to troubles that had included armed killers and a decades-old conspiracy told me that Eagle Village was far more sophisticated in its understanding of territorial politics than its rustic appearance suggested. As we stepped into the warmth of his cabin, I noticed that several other men were already waiting inside. Trappers, guides, and what looked like a few prospectors, all armed and all watching the children with expressions that mixed sympathy with grim determination. The map that Hutchins spread on his kitchen table showed the Yukon River system in detail that went far beyond what any civilian should have possessed, with markings and notations that suggested years of careful observation and intelligence gathering. "The organization you've encountered," he began without preamble, has been operating in these territories since before the gold rush, using the chaos and isolation to cover activities that would never be tolerated in more civilized regions. As he pointed to various locations along the river, I began to see a pattern of incidents. Missing persons, unexplained accidents, trading posts that had been abandoned overnight, that painted a picture of systematic intimidation and murder, spanning decades. The children sat close together near the fire, listening to every word with the intensity of survivors who understood that knowledge meant survival, while Thomas and the other men nodded at revelations that were obviously familiar. To them, the Northern Star was carrying more than passengers, Hutchins continued, his finger tracing the route the doomed steamboat had taken. There were documents, evidence of financial crimes and political corruption that reached all the way to Washington Territory and beyond. When certain powerful men learned that their secrets were being transported to authorities who might actually act on them, they arranged for the boat to have an accident. The casual way he discussed mass murder as a business decision sent ice through my veins, and I realized that the conspiracy we were fighting was larger and more deeply rooted than anything I had imagined in my worst nightmares. The revelation that followed hit me like a physical blow. The children's parents hadn't just been passengers on the Northern Star. They had been the federal investigators carrying those damning documents sent by Washington to gather evidence of corruption and murder in the territories. "Your father was a Treasury agent," Hutchins told Katya gently, "and your mother was a stenographer trained to document evidence in a way that would stand up in federal court. They were getting close to exposing the entire network when someone betrayed their mission." Katya's small hands clenched into fists as she listened, and I could see the 3 years of running and hiding crystallizing into a burning desire for justice that frightened me with its intensity. Dmitri, still weak from his ordeal on the river, leaned against his sister and whispered something in their native language that made her nod fiercely. The leather bundle in my coat suddenly felt like it contained dynamite rather than documents, and I began to understand why so many people had died to keep its contents secret, and why so many more would die before this was over. As the wind howled around Hutchins' cabin and the armed men of Eagle Village prepared for what was obviously going to be a siege, I realized that my simple life as a northern trapper had ended the moment I had heard those children crying on the frozen river, and that whatever came next would determine not just our survival, but whether justice would finally come to a wilderness that had been ruled by fear and violence for far too long. The sound that shattered the relative peace of our war council was the distant howling of sled dogs, but not the excited barking of a mail run or supply delivery. This was the purposeful, coordinated sound of multiple teams moving fast through the snow with military precision. Through the frost-covered windows of Hutchins's cabin, we could see lights moving through the trees on the far side of the settlement. More lights than Eagle Village had ever seen in a single night. And I knew that our brief respite was over. The organization that had sent the 3 dead men to my cabin had obviously decided that subtlety was no longer necessary, and they were bringing enough firepower to simply eliminate everyone who might have knowledge of their secrets. Thomas was already moving toward the back door, his rifle in his hands and his face set with the grim determination of a man who had been expecting this moment for years. "How many?" Hutchins asked, his voice steady despite the obvious gravity of the situation, and Thomas's answer sent a chill through everyone in the room. "Too many to fight, not enough to hide from." As the lights drew closer, and we could begin to make out individual figures moving through the snow with the coordinated precision of soldiers, I clutched the leather bundle that had brought this nightmare to our doorstep and wondered if the secrets of the Northern Star were worth the lives of an entire village of innocent people who had made the mistake of offering sanctuary to 2 orphaned children and 1 foolish ex-nurse who had thought she could find peace in the wilderness. The attack came with the first hint of dawn, not with the wild charge of desperate men, but with the methodical precision of a military operation designed to leave no survivors and no witnesses. I watched from the window of Hutchins's cabin as figures in white winter gear moved through Eagle Village like ghosts, cutting off escape routes and positioning themselves with the calculated efficiency of soldiers who had done this before in other remote settlements. The sound of breaking glass came from the trading post as they smashed windows to create firing positions, while other teams secured the dog yards and boat landings to ensure that no one could flee downriver when the killing began. Thomas appeared at my shoulder, his weathered face grim in the pale morning light, and whispered the words that confirmed my worst fears. "They're not just here for the children anymore. They're here to bury this entire story, along with everyone who's heard it." The leather bundle felt like molten lead against my ribs as I realized that my decision to protect two lost children had signed the death warrant for an entire community of innocent people who had made the mistake of offering us shelter. Through the frosted window pane, I could see at least 20 armed figures taking positions around the village. And I knew that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether the truth about the Northern Star would ever see daylight, or whether it would be buried forever beneath the snow and silence of the northern wilderness. Hutchins was already organizing the village's defense with the calm competence of someone who had commanded men in desperate situations before, assigning firing positions and escape routes with an efficiency that suggested Eagle Village had been preparing for this day longer than I had realized. The men who had gathered in his cabin were moving with practiced coordination, checking weapons and ammunition while the women and children were quietly evacuated to prepared hiding places that spoke of years of careful planning. "We always knew this day would come," Hutchins explained as he handed me a box of cartridges for my rifle, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what we were facing. "The organization you've stumbled into has been consolidating power in these territories for decades, eliminating anyone who threatens their operations, but they've never moved this openly before." As I watched Katya help her brother prepare for what might be their final flight from the killers who had already destroyed their family, I felt a familiar surge of the desperate determination that had kept me working through the worst days of the influenza outbreak. Some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The sound of rifle bolts working echoed through the cabin as Eagle Village prepared to make its stand, and I realized that we were about to become part of a war that had been raging in the shadows for longer than most people knew, a conflict between those who profited from the lawlessness of the frontier and those who believed that justice could exist even in the most remote corners of the world. The first shots came just as the sun crested the mountains across the river, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the morning gloom as the attackers opened fire on predetermined targets throughout the village. Windows exploded in showers of glass and splinters as bullets chewed through the log walls of cabins that had stood for decades, while the defenders of Eagle Village returned fire with the measured discipline of men who knew they were fighting for their lives and the lives of their families. Thomas had positioned himself in the bell tower of the small church, where his elevated position gave him a clear field of fire across the settlement, and I could see him picking off attackers with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to kill efficiently during harder times than these. The sound of splintering wood came from the back of Hutchins's cabin as bullets began finding their mark, and I realized that our position was becoming untenable with terrifying speed. Katya was crouched beside her brother near the fireplace, both children silent but alert, their young faces showing the kind of composure that only came from years of living with the constant threat of violence. As I watched them prepare for what might be their last stand, I made a decision that would either save us all or get us killed in the next few minutes. It was time to use the secrets we had been protecting as weapons rather than simply trying to keep them hidden. "The river," I called to Hutchins over the sound of gunfire, pointing toward the back of his cabin where a narrow trail led down to the water's edge. "If we can reach the boats—" But his sharp shake of the head cut me off before I could finish. The thought and his explanation sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold air pouring through the bullet holes in his walls. "Ice is starting to break up early this year," he said, reloading his rifle with hands that were steady despite our desperate situation. "Current's running fast and dangerous. Anyone who goes out there now won't make it a mile before the river takes them." The irony wasn't lost on me that the same spring thaw that should have offered us escape had instead become another trap, cutting off our retreat just as effectively as the armed killers who surrounded the village. Through the chaos of the firefight, I could hear the ominous sound of ice grinding against ice as the Yukon began its annual transformation from frozen highway to raging torrent, and I realized that we were caught between two forces of nature, human, greed, and the implacable power of the northern wilderness. The leather bundle in my coat seemed to pulse with each heartbeat as I considered our dwindling options, and I began to understand that the secrets of the Northern Star might die with us here in Eagle Village, buried beneath the snow and silence that had claimed so many other inconvenient truths in this unforgiving land. The explosion that rocked Hutchins's cabin came without warning, a blast that sent me sprawling across the floor as the front wall of the building disintegrated in a shower of logs and debris. Through the ringing in my ears, I could hear Katya screaming her brother's name, and when the smoke cleared enough for me to see, I found Dmitri pinned beneath a fallen beam, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. The attackers had brought dynamite, military-grade explosives that spoke of resources and planning that went far beyond what any civilian organization should have possessed, and they were systematically destroying the village's defensive positions with the ruthless efficiency of soldiers conducting a scorched earth campaign. As I struggled to free the boy from the wreckage of what had been our sanctuary, I could see armed figures moving through the smoke and debris, no longer content to maintain their positions, but advancing for the final assault that would leave no one alive to tell the story of what had happened here. Hutchins was on his feet, despite a nasty cut across his scalp, still firing at targets through the gaping hole where his front door had been, but I could see that our resistance was crumbling. With each passing minute, the sound of Thomas's rifle had gone silent from the church tower, and I didn't want to think about what that might mean for our chances of survival. With Dmitri freed from the debris but barely conscious, I knew that our only hope lay in reaching the river despite Hutchins's warnings about the dangerous ice conditions. The village was lost. I could see that now as flames began to spread from building to building and the sound of gunfire grew closer. But the children still had a chance if we could reach the water before the attackers completed their sweep through Eagle Village. "The documents," I said to Katya as I lifted her brother in my arms, feeling the weight of the leather bundle against my ribs like a promise of justice that might yet be fulfilled. "Your parents died trying to get them. To people who could act on what they contained, we can't let their sacrifice be meaningless." Her nod was fierce despite the tears streaming down her face, and I saw in her young eyes the same determination that had kept her alive through 3 years of running and hiding from the killers who had destroyed her family. Thomas appeared, through the smoke like a ghost, blood streaming from a wound across his shoulder but his rifle still ready, and his presence gave me hope that we might actually have a chance of escaping the slaughter that was consuming the only home these people had ever known. As we moved toward the back of the ruined cabin, stepping over debris and dodging the bullets that continued to punch through the walls, I realized that we were about to attempt something that was either incredibly brave or absolutely suicidal. But, in a situation where death was certain if we stayed, even the slimmest chance of survival was worth taking. The trail down to the river was treacherous with loose snow and hidden ice, made even more dangerous by the need to move quickly while carrying an injured child and dodging the bullets of pursuers who had realized that their quarry was escaping toward the water. I could hear shouts behind us as the attackers discovered our escape route, followed by the sound of boots crashing through the underbrush as they gave chase with the desperate urgency of men who knew their mission depended on leaving no witnesses alive. The Yukon spread before us in the pale morning light, its surface a patchwork of solid ice and dark water that spoke of the dangerous unpredictability of breakup season. when the river transformed from a frozen highway into a raging torrent that could swallow boats, sleds, and entire teams of dogs without leaving so much as a ripple to mark their passing. Thomas was already pushing one of Hutchins's boats toward the water's edge, his movements quick and efficient despite the blood that continued to seep from his shoulder wound, while Katya helped me settle her brother into the bow where he would be as protected as possible from the elements and any pursuing gunfire. The sound of our hunters grew closer as we prepared to launch into water that might kill us just as surely as the bullets we were fleeing, and I realized that we were about to trust our lives to the same forces of nature that had claimed the Northern Star and its passengers 3 years earlier. The moment our boat touched the water, I understood why Hutchins had been so reluctant to let us attempt this escape. The current was running faster and stronger than anything I had experienced. In my 3 years of northern living, and chunks of ice the size of wagons were grinding past us with enough force to crush our small craft like kindling, Thomas was manning the oars with the desperate strength of someone who knew that survival depended on staying ahead of both the ice and the bullets that were now splashing into the water around us, while I used a spare paddle to fend off the smaller ice chunks that threatened to hole our boat and send us to the bottom of the river. Katya was holding her brother close, whispering what sounded like prayers in their native language while keeping watch for the muzzle flashes of rifles along the shore, and I could see in her young face the same mixture of terror and determination that I had seen in the faces of wounded soldiers who knew they were fighting their last battle. The leather bundle was still secure in my coat, its weight a constant reminder of why we were risking everything on this desperate flight downriver, and I found myself wondering if the secrets it contained were worth the price we were paying and might yet pay to keep them from falling into the wrong hands. As our boat was swept into the main channel of the Yukon, I caught one last glimpse of Eagle Village burning behind us, the smoke rising into the morning sky like a funeral pyre for all the innocent people who had died trying to protect 2 orphaned children and the truth their parents had died to preserve. The roar of the ice-choked rapids ahead was like the sound of a freight train bearing down on us, and I realized that our escape from the killers in Eagle Village had delivered us directly into the hands of a force that was far more impartial and potentially more deadly than human greed. The river was running wild with the power of the spring thaw, carrying us toward unknown dangers at a speed that made steering almost impossible, while chunks of ice continued to crash around our fragile boat like the artillery shells I had dodged during my service in the field. Hospitals. Thomas was shouting something over the roar of the water, but his words were lost in the chaos of our desperate flight, and I could only follow his gestures as he pointed toward what looked like a slightly calmer stretch of water along the far shore. Dmitri was stirring in his sister's arms, his young face pale but alert as he began to understand the magnitude of the danger we were facing, while Katya continued to watch the shoreline for signs of pursuit with the vigilance of someone who had learned never to trust in temporary safety. The secrets of the Northern Star felt heavier than ever as we fought to survive the same forces that had claimed the steamboat and its passengers, and I couldn't help but wonder if we were doomed to repeat their fate, or if we might somehow succeed where they had failed and finally bring justice to a wilderness that had been ruled by violence and corruption for far too long. As our boat plunged into the white water ahead, I gripped the leather bundle one final time and prepared to discover whether the truth was strong enough to survive the trial by ice and water that would determine our fate in the next few terrifying minutes. The rapids spat us out into a relatively calm stretch of the river just as our boat began taking on water from the battering it had received from the ice chunks, and I realized that we had perhaps minutes before we would be swimming in water cold enough to kill us in less time than it took to say a prayer. Thomas was already bailing frantically with his hat, while steering toward what looked like a sheltered cove along the eastern shore, his movements efficient, despite the blood loss that was making his face pale as fresh snow. Through the pre-dawn gloom, I could make out a dark shape jutting from the riverbank ahead, something too regular and geometric to be natural rock formation, and as we drew closer, My heart nearly stopped as I recognized the distinctive outline of a steamboat's stern wheel partially buried in the accumulated debris of 3 years' worth of spring floods. It was the Northern Star, or what remained of her after the river had finished its work, lying like a broken promise in the shallows, where the current had finally deposited her after the accident that had claimed the lives of Katya and Dimitri's parents. The irony of our desperate flight bringing us to this graveyard of secrets wasn't lost on me, and as Thomas guided our sinking boat toward the wreck, I felt the leather bundle pulse against my ribs like a heart that had been waiting 3 years to finish beating. Whatever answers we needed about the conspiracy that had cost so many lives, we were about to find them in the bones of the ship that had carried the first victims to their deaths. Thomas beached our boat beside the wreck with the last of his strength, and I could see that the shoulder wound was worse than he had let on. Blood had soaked through his coat and was beginning to freeze in the morning air, creating dark stains that spoke of internal damage that needed immediate attention. But there was no time for medical care, not with the children shivering from cold and shock, and not with the possibility that our pursuers might still be tracking us downriver despite the chaos we had left behind in Eagle Village. The Northern Star loomed above us like a monument to violence and greed, her hull cracked open to reveal the dark interior where passengers had once traveled in comfort and safety, never knowing that their journey would end in murder disguised as maritime disaster. Katya was staring at the wreck with an expression that mixed grief with something darker, a hunger for answers that had been building for 3 years of running and hiding from the truth of what had happened to her family. As I helped Dimitri from our boat, his young face still pale from his injuries but his eyes alert and focused on the steamboat that had become his parents' tomb, I realized that we had come full circle in a story that had begun with secrets and would end with either justice or our own deaths in the same waters that had claimed the original victims. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the sound of distant engines that might have been more boats or might have been the ghosts of steam whistles that would never blow again, and I knew that whatever we discovered in the wreck would have to be found quickly before the river claimed us as well. Inside the Northern Star, the devastation was more complete than I had expected, not just the damage of 3 years of weather and ice, but the systematic destruction of someone who had been looking for something specific among the wreckage. Cabins had been ransacked with the thorough efficiency of professional searchers, floors ripped up and walls torn apart in a hunt for hidden compartments or concealed safes that might have contained the evidence that so many people had died to suppress. But it was Thomas who found what we were looking for, his experienced eyes spotting the irregularity in the ship's structure that my medical training had missed, a section of the cargo hold where the walls didn't quite match the rest of the construction, suggesting modification that had been done after the boat's original building. "Hidden compartment," he said, his voice weak but determined as he pried at the boards with a piece of broken metal from the ship's fittings. "Your parents weren't just carrying documents. They were carrying them in a place where no one would think to look, even if they captured the boat." The wood gave way with a crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space of the wrecked steamboat, and suddenly we were looking into a waterproof chamber that had protected its contents through 3 years of flooding and freezing. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed with wax, were bundles of papers that represented the life's work of 2 federal investigators who had died trying to expose corruption that reached from the goldfields of the Yukon all the way to the halls of power in Washington Territory. The documents that spilled from that hidden compartment told a story of systematic theft and murder that dwarfed anything I had imagined during our desperate flight from the killers who had destroyed Eagle Village. There were records of mine claims that had been seized through forged documents, shipping manifests that detailed the smuggling of gold ore across territorial boundaries to avoid taxation, and correspondence between territorial officials and criminal organizations that revealed a network of corruption spanning decades and involving some of the most prominent names in Northwestern politics. But it was the final bundle of papers, marked with the same golden ship emblem that we had seen on our attackers' clothing, that contained the most damning evidence of all. Detailed financial records showing how a secret society of wealthy investors had been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened their control over the region's mineral wealth. Katya was reading over my shoulder, her young face growing harder with each revelation about the scope of the conspiracy that had killed her parents, while Dmitri sat nearby with his sister's coat wrapped around his small frame, still weak, but listening to every word with the intensity of someone who understood that these papers represented both justice and vengeance for his murdered family. Thomas was growing weaker by the minute, his face gray with blood loss, but his eyes remained sharp as he studied the documents that revealed the true magnitude of what we were fighting against. Not just a criminal organization, but a shadow government that had been ruling the Northern Territories through fear and violence for longer than most people realized. The sound of engines grew louder as we studied the evidence that had cost so many lives to preserve, and through the gaps in the Northern Star's broken hull, I could see boats approaching our position with the methodical precision of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. "They followed the river," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to remain conscious despite his injuries. "Probably had boats waiting downstream in case we survived the rapids." The irony of our situation wasn't lost on me. We had finally found the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy that had been terrorizing the territories for decades, but we were about to be killed before we could get that evidence to anyone with the power to act on it. Katya was gathering the documents with hands that shook from more than just the cold. Her young face set with a determination that reminded me of her parents' dedication to justice, while Dmitri struggled to his feet despite his injuries, unwilling to face death sitting down. The leather bundle in my coat now seemed insignificant compared to the wealth of evidence we had discovered in the steamboat's hidden compartment, but I knew that all of it would be worthless if we couldn't survive. The next few minutes long enough to get the documents to federal authorities who weren't part of the conspiracy themselves. As the sound of our pursuers grew closer and I could make out individual voices calling orders in the dawn light, I realized that we were about to face the final test of whether the truth was strong enough to survive against overwhelming odds and unlimited resources. The boats that emerged from the morning mist carried more armed men than I could count, their faces hidden by scarves and hoods, but their weapons clearly visible as they positioned themselves to cut off any possible escape from the wreck of the Northern Star. At their head was a figure I recognized despite the years that had passed since I had last seen him, Dr. Marcus Wolfe, the territorial administrator who had processed my application to practice medicine in the northern regions, and who had seemed like nothing more than a bureaucrat concerned with paperwork and regulations. But now, as he stood in the bow of the lead boat with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes, I understood that he was far more than a simple government official. He was one of the architects of the conspiracy that had been bleeding the territories dry for decades, and his presence here meant that our discovery of the hidden documents had triggered a response from the very highest levels of the shadow organization we were fighting. "Dr. Morgan," he called across the water with the same polite tone he had used in his office years earlier. "You have something that belongs to us, and we've come to collect it along with the children who have been causing us so much trouble." His casual reference to murder as a collection problem told me everything I needed to know about the kind of men we were dealing with, and as his boats moved closer to our position, I realized that we were facing not just killers, but killers who wore the badge of legitimate authority while they destroyed everything that authority was supposed to protect. The standoff that developed among the bones of the Northern Star felt like something from a nightmare, with armed men positioned to kill us the moment we showed ourselves while we huddled in the wreckage of the boat that had carried our evidence to its hiding place 3 years earlier. Thomas was barely conscious now, his breathing shallow and labored as his body fought the effects of blood loss and exposure, but his eyes remained fixed on the documents that represented the last hope of bringing justice to a wilderness that had been ruled by violence and greed for far too long. Katya was helping her brother arrange the papers in order of importance, her young hands working with the efficiency of someone who understood that these might be the last few minutes of her life and wanted to ensure that the most damning evidence would be found even if we didn't survive to deliver it personally. "The mine records," she said quietly, pointing to a bundle of documents that detailed how the conspiracy had been seizing claims from independent prospectors through forged deeds and manufactured legal challenges. These show names, dates, amounts stolen, everything needed to prosecute them in federal court. Her matter-of-fact discussion of prosecution while surrounded by killers told me that she had inherited more than just her parents' courage. She had inherited their unshakable faith that justice would eventually triumph over corruption, even if it cost them everything they had. As Dr. Wolf's voice echoed across the water, offering us safe passage in exchange for the documents and the children, I found myself wondering if faith alone would be enough to see us through what was about to unfold. The explosion that rocked. The Northern Star came without warning, a blast that sent debris flying through the air and opened new holes in the already damaged hull as Dr. Wolf demonstrated that his patience had limits and his willingness to use violence had none. That was a warning. His voice carried clearly across the water as smoke cleared from where his men had detonated a charge near our position. "The next one will be closer, and the one after that will finish what the river started 3 years. Ego." The casual way he discussed murdering us in the same place where Katya and Dmitri's parents had died told me that this man had moved far beyond simple greed into the kind of calculated evil that treated human life as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed when convenient. But it was Thomas who provided the answer to our desperate situation. His voice weak but urgent as he pointed toward a section of the steamboat's hull that I had overlooked in our search for evidence. "Emergency flare," he whispered, his words barely audible over the sound of water lapping against the wreck. Ship's safety equipment still might work after all these years. The possibility of signaling for help seemed almost too good to be true, but as I followed his pointing finger to where a metal box was secured to the bulkhead, I realized that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources. As Dr. Wolf's men prepared for another, more deadly demonstration of their firepower, I found myself wondering if a single flare could possibly be enough to save us from the forces that had been systematically destroying everyone who threatened their control over the northern territories. The flare that arced high into the morning sky burned like a red star against the pale dawn, its brilliant light visible for miles along the river as it announced our desperate situation to anyone who might be watching for signs of trouble in the wilderness. Dr. Wolf's reaction was immediate and violent. His men opened fire on our position with everything they had, bullets chewing through the already damaged hull of the Northern Star as they tried to silence us before help could arrive. But the damage was already done. The signal had been sent, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of steam whistles answering our call for assistance with the deep, powerful notes of boats much larger than anything in Dr. Wolf's fleet. Katya was shielding her brother with her own body as bullets splintered the wood around us, while I used my medical bag to protect the documents that represented our only hope of exposing the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives over the years. Thomas was unconscious now, his face gray with blood loss, but his breathing remained steady enough to give me hope that he might survive if we could get him to proper medical care in time. The sound of approaching steamboats grew louder as federal marshals responded to our distress signal, their arrival promising either rescue or a battle that would determine whether justice would finally come to the territories, or whether the shadow organization would succeed in burying the truth along with everyone who had tried to expose it. As the first federal boat came into view around the bend in the river, I clutched the documents that had cost so many lives to preserve and prepared to discover whether our desperate gamble would finally bring an end to decades of murder and corruption in the frozen wilderness that had become our battlefield. The federal steamboat that rounded the bend in the river was the Territorial Justice. and I had never seen a more beautiful sight than her twin smokestacks, cutting through the morning mist with the authority of the United States government behind every turn of her paddle wheel. Dr. Wolf's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of standing his ground to fight federal marshals, he ordered his men to retreat with the desperate haste of someone who knew that his carefully constructed empire of corruption was about to crumble under the weight of official scrutiny. But retreat wasn't enough to save him now. The documents we had discovered in the Northern Star's hidden compartment contained enough evidence to hang half the territorial administration and send the other half to federal prison for the rest of their lives. As bullets continued to fly around us and the sound of the federal boat's steam whistle echoed across the water like a trumpet announcing the arrival of justice, I pressed the leather bundle against my chest and realized that we had finally reached the end of a journey that had cost so many lives but might still result in the truth prevailing over the forces of greed and violence that had ruled the northern territories for far too long. Katya was holding her brother close as federal marshals returned fire on our behalf, her young face showing a mixture of hope and disbelief that help had actually arrived after 3 years of running from killers who seemed to have unlimited resources and reach. The sound of Dr. Wolf's boats retreating upriver was music to my ears, even though I knew that this battle was won, but the war for justice was just beginning. The federal marshals who pulled us from the wreck of the Northern Star moved with the professional efficiency of men who had been expecting to find exactly what we had discovered, and I realized that our desperate flight downriver had been part of a larger investigation that had been building for months. Marshal James Crawford, a lean man with gray eyes that missed nothing, took possession of the documents with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the excitement of a lawman who had finally found the evidence needed to bring down criminals he had been hunting for years. "We've been tracking the organization you stumbled into," he explained as his men worked to stabilize Thomas's injuries and get the children wrapped in warm blankets aboard the federal boat. "Your escape from Eagle Village and the signal flare gave us the excuse we needed to move openly against them, but without these documents, we never would have been able to prove the scope of their operations. The magnitude of what we had helped expose was staggering, not just the specific crimes detailed in the documents from the Northern Star, but a pattern of exploitation that had been destroying communities and families across thousands of square miles of frontier territory." Thomas was recovering slowly under the care of the boat's doctor, his shoulder wound serious, but not life-threatening, and I could see in his weathered face a satisfaction that matched my own. The knowledge that his years of watching and waiting had finally paid off in a victory for justice over corruption. As I watched him examine the mine records and correspondence that detailed decades of theft and murder, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced during my years of medical practice. The knowledge that justice might finally come to victims who had been waiting far too long for someone to care about their stories. The trials that followed our arrival in Dawson City became the sensation of the territorial press, with reporters traveling from as far away as Seattle and San Francisco to cover the proceedings that would expose the full extent of the conspiracy we had helped bring to light. Dr. Wolf was captured trying to flee across the border into British Columbia, his carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbling as the evidence mounted against him and his associates in what the newspapers called the greatest criminal conspiracy in the history of the American frontier. Katya and Dmitri testified with the courage of children who had survived horrors that would have broken most adults, their clear, precise recollections of their parents' murder, providing the emotional weight that transformed legal proceedings into a moral reckoning for an entire territory. Watching them take the stand to face the men who had killed their family was one of the most inspiring and heartbreaking experiences of my life as they spoke their parents' names aloud in a courtroom, for the first time in 3 years, and demanded justice in voices that carried the authority of innocence confronting absolute evil. The convictions came swiftly. Dr. Wolf and 12 of his associates were sentenced to hang, while dozens of others received prison terms that would keep them behind bars for the rest of their lives. The changes that swept through the territorial administration following the trials were comprehensive and swift, with federal investigators arriving to audit every aspect of government operations and root out the remaining traces of the conspiracy that had infected so many levels of authority. New mining laws were enacted to protect independent prospectors from the kind of claim jumping and legal manipulation that had been used to steal fortunes from honest men, while enhanced federal oversight ensured that territorial officials would no longer be able to operate with the impunity that had made such massive corruption possible. But the real victory wasn't in the punishment of the guilty. It was in the dismantling of a system that had allowed such crimes to flourish in the shadows of legitimate government authority. Katya and Dmitri became wards of the federal court, but not the kind of powerless orphans that the legal system usually produced. They were survivors whose testimony had brought down a criminal empire, and their future was secured by a trust fund established from the assets seized from the conspiracy's members. I was appointed as their guardian, a role that felt like the most important work I had ever undertaken, more meaningful than any surgery I had performed or any patient I had saved during my years of medical practice. Watching them slowly learn, to trust again, to believe that they could have a future without constantly looking over their shoulders for killers, was a healing process that benefited all three of us as we built a new kind of family from the ashes of tragedy and violence. Thomas returned to his traditional lands along the river, but now as a federal scout and guide whose knowledge of the wilderness and its people had proven invaluable in tracking down the remaining members of the criminal organization. The Golden ship emblems were gathered up and melted down, their precious metal donated to a fund that would compensate the families of those who had been killed or robbed by the conspiracy, transforming symbols of greed and violence into instruments of healing and restoration. Their resilience amazed me daily, proof that the human spirit could survive and even triumph over the worst kinds of evil that men could devise, as the nightmares came less frequently and were replaced by dreams of the future that their parents had died trying to secure. Katya threw herself into her education with the fierce dedication of someone who understood that knowledge was power, while Dmitri slowly emerged from the shell of silence that had protected him during the worst years of their ordeal. The cabin I built for us outside Dawson City was everything a home should be, a place of safety, learning, and healing where the past could be acknowledged without being allowed to poison the future. The snow that fell during our last night in the cabin was soft and gentle, nothing like the driving blizzards that had nearly killed us during our flight from Eagle Village, and as I watched it accumulate on the windowsills, I thought about all the secrets that had been buried beneath the snow of the Northern Territories over the years. Secrets that would have remained hidden forever if not for the courage of 2 children and the dedication of people who believed that justice was worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The letter that had arrived with the spring mail in 1919 bore the seal of the Department of Justice in Washington, inviting Katya and Dmitri to visit the nation's capital as honored guests, where they would be recognized for their courage in exposing crimes that had threatened the integrity of federal authority across the entire northwestern frontier. Reading that letter aloud to them in our kitchen, seeing their faces light up with pride rather than fear as they contemplated traveling to the seat of government that their parents had died serving, was a moment of triumph that validated every risk we had taken and every sacrifice we had made. Tomorrow, we would begin our journey south to a new life built on the foundation of truth rather than the shifting sands of deception and violence, carrying with us the knowledge that we had helped expose one of the greatest criminal conspiracies in American history and ensured that its victims would finally receive the justice they deserved. Katya was reading to her brother from one of the adventure novels we had bought in Dawson City, her voice strong and confident as she brought fictional heroes to life for a boy who had lived through adventures more harrowing than anything any novelist could imagine. The sound of their laughter filled our cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in our stove, and I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not the dramatic courtroom scenes or newspaper headlines, but the simple pleasure of children who were finally free to be children, learning and growing in safety under the protection of laws that actually meant something. As I banked the fire for the night and prepared for sleep in a home where we no longer had to take turns standing watch, I offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the chain of events that had brought us together and the strength we had found. To see justice done even when it seemed impossible that truth could triumph over such overwhelming forces of corruption and evil. We kept the documents from the Northern Star in a special case in our main room, not as trophies of our victory over the conspiracy, but as reminders of the price that had been paid for the justice we now lived under and the vigilance required to ensure that such corruption never took root again.